I'm more confident. Once I'm in the ring, I'm a god. No one can beat me. I walk around the ring, but I never take my eyes off my opponent. I keep my eyes on him, even if he's ready and pumping. He can't wait to get his hands on me as well. I keep my eyes on him. I keep my eyes on him. I keep my eyes on him. Then once I see a chink in his arm, boom.
So when I was originally tasked with placing all of my philosophies and methodological approaches into one cohesive system, I first thought, okay, if I am going to certify anyone, if I'm going to influence anyone else, as a Bozada performance systems coach, for example, then what would be the things that I would want them bringing to the table? Okay, what would set them apart? What could someone else, several years from now in the future say, oh, that must be a BPS guy, or he's doing things like Bozada performance systems. What would those things be? And it's actually what I feel is missing the most in the industry. So I had to start thinking about, how can we separate ourselves? What can we do different? And what do I see not happening that I feel should be happening? And so I started thinking about a lot of my principles, which we'll kind of get through throughout this recording. But one of the biggest things is just valuing constraints over objectives. So I feel like much of the world and performance industry in general is far too focused on objectives, getting from A to Z, without a real adequate battle plan, and nothing strategic for doing so, besides maybe just throwing up workouts every day and just pushing yourself hard. And, in other words, not thinking about how do we articulate this journey in the best way versus just trying to blast through all the walls, right? Just with brute force. So that's the way that I view the constraints over objectives. And you can get more into constraints if you look up constraint programming. It's actually a computer science term, but it's very applicable to performance. So I'm looking at constraints. Okay, what are the biggest constraints on the human body that I have noticed in my practice and experience? And those two, I would have to say, are breathing, protocols and mechanics, and mobility. Both breath work and mobility are highly overused. I don't even like the terms anymore, but you get the idea. So when we're talking about these things, I would then want to apply them through the lens of my principles. So a few of those that we'll talk about today is recognizing that the basics have become the new advanced. And that's something that I've just been realizing over the past few years. So you have so many people in the world that have just been pushed through programs or methods and, haven't been given the right knowledge base, or the awareness to figure out how to do this most appropriately. And so then I get people that they may be elite athletes, they may be high performance athletes, but when we go through certain assessments or we look at their movement patterns or I just observe them without telling them I'm observing their breathing, because then they would modify it. We see how quickly their breathing just goes out. So I just feel like that's a huge principle that I always try to uphold, is just getting people to realize that, no matter what the level of the person is, the basics are now the new advanced, because that's just how the system and how the performance industry has done things. So we need to teach people how to be mobile again, how to get in position to actually move. If you can't even get in position to move, how do you think you can move? If you can articulate your joints. So breathing is the same way. So when we're talking about breath work, we're realizing very quickly that something that could be as simple as breathing is actually highly neglected. And so when we're talking about this, we want to start thinking about the perspective of from the nervous system out. Okay, so I want you to realize that this is all internal work. Okay, so we need this internal knowledge so that we can then express externally in movement and performance. So this is what I would call internal training. Okay, and mobility really is too. And so we want to bring about this heightened sense of intention and awareness. Okay, so we want to have intention in the workout. The goal isn't just to grab the barbell or the row or whatever and just go crazy, okay? Because that is not sustainable. We all know that, but everyone is still guilty of that. Okay, so we need to learn how to have intention, awareness, and some humility, really, because this type of work is very, very It's not glamorous. It's very rough. It's not something you're going to want to videotape and put on Instagram necessarily, because people are just going to see you working really hard on your breathing. But it is glorious, and it's very much so worth doing. So it's not about the objectives, again, it's about the constraints, and it's not about the numbers or the outcomes at the moment. It's about alleviating these restraints that you have on your system from not focusing on breathing. All right, so if I had to put it into a little thought chart, like a flow chart, so to speak, I would start with the nervous system. This is where it all starts, with the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system. From there, we go into the actual breathing mechanics. So are you breathing through your nose? Are you breathing through your mouth? Are you mixing them? And so on. Those are going to affect either parasympathetic or sympathetic nervous system. From there, we get into the energy systems. So it's nervous system, breathing, energy systems. Depending on the state of your nervous system and the way that you are breathing, you are then going to draw upon different pools of energy system reserves. So we would either be in the aerobic or anaerobic state, more so than the other. They don't really exist in isolation, which is where it gets kind of complicated. So what can we derive from that? It's that depending on the state of your nervous system, your stress levels, your arousal level to CO2 particularly, our respiration type is derived from that and is engaged, and we either draw upon one energy system or the other. And then, you know, it gets kind of crazy when you start to think about, this is something I've neglected. I have not been thinking about for this long. And when you run through the sessions, I'm going to give you some examples on some slides here pretty soon. It's just, keep this in mind. It's going to be a whole new awakening to what has been neglected, because so many people are so focused on the objectives and the external work and not working on your internal functionalities. All right. I'm just trying to get through everything before we get to the slides. Something else I really recommend people start to look at is something called the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve. Okay, it's a mouthful, but essentially it's an S curve on a linear vertical and horizontal axis. What we're looking at is essentially your body's ability to uptake oxygen, place it into the bloodstream, and then release it. What you start to notice pretty quickly is that most people are not able to adequately release the oxygen from the red blood cells and perfuse it into the tissues. So if we were all to, you know, have our oxygen saturation levels taken right now, we'd all probably be great, you know, or pretty good. But that does not mean that oxygen is getting into the tissues and where we need it the most, especially when we're moving. Okay, and so what this curve shows you, something else we should look at is the Bohr effect from Christian Bohr. Look up the Bohr effect. It's going to show us how effective we are with the Bohr effect. So as we overbreathe, we start to release far too much CO2, okay? And it's kind of crazy because a lot of times we're taught CO2 is this waste product. We need the oxygen, right? So we need to breathe, and then CO2 leaves, and it's because we don't need it. No, we need CO2 to actually knock that oxygen molecule off of those red blood cells and perfuse them into our tissues. So the more that we overbreathe, the more we offload valuable CO2, and the less we have in our body to release that oxygen. So then we continue just to hyperventilate and freak out, okay? Instead of just slowing down, slow down the breath rate, internalize for a moment, start to get into your nervous system, control things, slow down, okay? So getting that breath work dialed in is really gonna help you become more efficient at what you're doing, the most efficient at what you're doing. And the way that I kind of view this is, it's as if oxygen is this door. You know, we all see oxygen as the door. That's the way, right? But CO2, carbon dioxide, is actually the hand that opens that door. We don't get to go through that door, all right, unless we have those CO2 levels locked in. How do we get better at this? Well, my approach is to start to exploit CO2 tolerance. So your body's tolerance to deal with CO2. Okay, you could look at CO2 as almost like a stress molecule. It's your trigger to breathe, and if you don't have it, it's also going to get harder to do so. So we need to look at something called the CO2 tolerance test. This is usually how I recommend people start. So This is something you could do it several different ways, but the way I have people do it is just to sit down or lie down, try to relax, take in 5 normal breaths in through the nose, out the nose. On that 5th exhale, I want it to trickle out as slow as you possibly can. Think of it as like an eccentric contraction in exercise, but I want it to be the slowest eccentric you can possibly handle, painfully slow. So 5th inhale goes in. On the exhale, very, very slow. You should barely hear it coming out. But the point is, you have to be constantly exhaling. You don't get to hold, and you don't get to just let it go. There has to be constant trickle, constant flow of air exhaling. Once you get to the point that the air is gone, or that you have to just let it go, and you must breathe, the test is over. So you need to time that. How long from that last beginning of that exhale were you able to exhale? How long did you go? And I'm not going to talk about numbers because that's just going to be objective-based mindset. But you want to increase that number, okay? We want to increase your ability to release that breath as that CO2 is increasing. And you're going to feel that trigger to breathe. That's that CO2 building up. That is the new constraint, okay? I want you to focus on in your training is let's push that barrier. I'm starving of air right now. I need to breathe. It's a crazy feeling, all right? And we need to get that to improve, all right? So we start with that CO2 tolerance test. Another thing I had Rosario and some of the people in the level 1 certification process go through is what I call the 5-minute breath test. Okay, so we get on a piece of cardio equipment, a rower, ski erg, treadmill, assault bike, whatever. And for 5 minutes, you are only allowed to take 1 breath every 5 seconds. That sounds like no problem right off the bat, but I promise you it will be. Okay, so that means nose to nose only. We're going to breathe in the nose and out the nose. That, for instance, would be 5 seconds. That's all you get. So, for example, you can inhale for 2.5 seconds and then exhale for 2.5 seconds. That would be kind of the perfect wave. Try to maintain that for 5 minutes as you inch up the intensity of your movement. Start super slow. If it's too easy, kick up that intensity. What you're going to realize very quickly is you're going to hit a certain wattage or RPM that you cannot maintain that nose to nose every 5 seconds. You're going to start gaming the system. You're going to start trying to breathe a little early or take in a bigger inhale but release the exhale longer. You're going to start trying to make ways to cheat the system. That's when you need to slow back down, all right? It's a huge ego check. It's a huge metabolic check. The goal is to slow down. It's not to finish fast. You've got 5 minutes regardless, all right? I don't care how fast you go. Maintain the breathing. That's the only objective, all right? So we get into something about called breathing gears. These are the 5 different modes, if you will, of breathing and how to focus on those through different types of workouts. I'm going to show you a diagram here pretty soon. We do some hypoxic work. Okay, so that's essentially your body's capacity to operate on low oxygen levels or no oxygen levels. So there's a lot of performance benefit to that. And then something I'm working on personally is actually something that I'm just calling it lung mobility for now. It's a lot more than that, but it's essentially just working on the lung tissue specifically. And that's going to be something we're going to talk about in Bozada performance systems in the future. It's kind of something, a new endeavor for me. So I'm not quite ready to release that yet, but we're working on that right now. So, all right. Okay. So this is just a visual summary, if you will, of what we've just been talking about. So Louis Simmons of Westside Barbell, I highly recommend you look into his work. Not necessarily for breath work, but for everything else. He says, when you attempt to build capacity on dysfunction, you're actually deepening the attractor state of your compensation. Thus, you're building compensation, not capacity. We're not getting any better. You're just getting better at suffering, all right? So we want to make this process as easy as possible, right? There's times to work hard, but there's also times just to work smart and efficient. So this is what I was talking about before. If we're to kind of break this down into like a thought flow chart, a way to think about it from one stage to the next. None of these exist in isolation, but I kind of like to think of it from the nervous system out. So we start with the nervous system. Depending on whether we're in the red or blue here, sympathetic or parasympathetic, we are going to have a breathing rate derived from that. So for sympathetic, we're more fight or flight, stressed, panic. Parasympathetic, we're a little more relaxed, flow state, rest and digest. But we want some of both of those almost at all times. And then if we're sympathetic, we're going to get into that mouth breathing typically versus nose breathing, more parasympathetic. Okay, so that's where the second stage breathing comes in. Then we've got the third stage there, energy systems. So sympathetic is going to pull mostly from your anaerobic system. Parasympathetic is going to be a little more on the aerobic side. Again, if we can kind of splice those, that's better than just going full anaerobic and being toasted in 30 seconds. All right, so little note down there at the bottom is in an anaerobic environment, glucose will yield 2 ATP. All right. In an aerobic environment, your glucose will yield 36 ATP. So I mean, it's roughly 18 times the efficiency. So that's just something I feel is very important to keep in mind. These are in-session considerations that we talk about in the BPS seminars. We don't necessarily have to go through all of these. I just want to kind of share them with you, and you can kind of read through them on your own. But we're just talking about, that ego and metabolic check that you'll have in a workout. Are you breathing through the mouth, very soon into a workout? What's happening when you open the mouth? We're tapping into glycogen, sympathetic dominant system. Maybe that's not necessary at the moment. If you've got 30 minutes to work out, you should probably relax and not get into that yet. When you breathe through the nose, we're using the physiology a little more efficiently. If we're overbreathing, like we talked about before, we're not getting enough CO2 buildup in the system to actually utilize that oxygen. So that's why we just continue to hyperventilate. Then you start to get cramps because those muscles are spasming. It's just a mess. So once fatigue sets in, we start to expose those vulnerabilities in your armor. Okay, what's been missing in your training? What are your survival mechanisms? What's next? Do you just lay out on the floor, or do you just keep dragging yourself through it? More often than not, it's the path of least resistance, which is something else I talk about a lot in the seminars. And unfortunately, taking the path of least resistance at all times will tend to manifest throughout your entire life, and that's something we want to avoid. Here's those breathing gears. Gear 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. In the parentheses there, you can see nose to nose is low aerobic. So just kind of nice, even work. If we power nasal in to relax nasal out, we're getting a little more into high aerobic. Power nose in and then nose out is anaerobic threshold. So power nose to nose. So that's when things are getting real close to, I need to switch over to a little bit of mouth breathing because that intensity is rising. Gear 4, power nasal in and mouth out. So that's where we're, it's the last resort before we're full on sympathetic, breathing through the mouth. Gear 5, mouth to mouth, high anaerobic. Here's the hypoxic variation that we do in the seminars. You're attempting to do this work here, nose to nose breathing only. And then you're attempting to go through some breath work, hold your last exhale, pick up a load, and attempt to take steps with it. You don't go very far, especially in the very beginning. Take a little break, repeat again. Just something to try out, take a picture, and send me any questions if you have any. We're kind of going kind of quick here. General systems theory and dynamic systems theory is something I talk a lot about. So if the input is stress and the nervous system cannot integrate with the constraints of the stress, producing a favorable response in the end, then the overall system is compromised and we're less likely to survive. Okay, that's more of an evolutionary take on things. Whether surviving means getting through your workout, your game, or life, I think it's all pretty comparable. So something else we've been talking about today is, are we getting the adaptations we truly want in our training, or are we just getting better at suffering? Okay, is everything just constantly sucking because we're not actually training what needs to be trained? If that's happening, we need to start reconsidering our focus a little bit. Okay, again, there are times for this. There are times for just blasting yourself and being out, all right, but it should not be all the time. And things should be getting a little bit easier. So we're going to finish up here with this last slide. Sorry. Quality over quantity, big principle of mine. Doing less better is more than doing more less is good, right? So stop focusing on objectives, numbers, data, start focusing simply on your ability to improve. We want to stop using the burn or fatigue of exercise as a metric for success. Like, oh yeah, that's good. You know, it must be good to feel like this. Not always. All right, let's make the new goal to see how long we can perform under these new progressive constraints. And that's it. All right, so let's just focus on the breathing in addition to everything else we're doing, and just try to improve all around. Okay, I think it's a highly overlooked scenario. So that's it, and that was really fast.
Ok, eccoci. Spero che abbiate capito qualcosa. In realtà i suoi concetti sono molto interessanti e ho avuto la fortuna di fare un suo corso in Italia. Come dicevamo prima, Bozada Performance System Level 1, si parla fondamentalmente di questo, si parla di come la respirazione può incidere sulla nostra prestazione, in generale nella nostra vita. Quello che ha detto Bozada all'inizio è fondamentalmente che noi ci concentriamo molto spesso sui fattori esterni, tralasciando i principi che sono chiaramente alla base. In realtà l'avanzato oggi è il principio. Lavorando attraverso la respirazione sono due le cose che dobbiamo fare. Dobbiamo aumentare l'intenzione ed essere consapevoli di quello che facciamo. In una prestazione, per intenderci, siamo in preda alla fatica, all'anidride carbonica, eccetera, eccetera, piuttosto che sotto stress, quando attiviamo il sistema simpatico, non riusciamo a gestire le nostre emozioni e il nostro respiro. Per poter lavorare sulla respirazione bisogna conoscere un modello basato su sistemi energetici, quindi sistema simpatico e sistema parasimpatico, sulla respirazione quindi sistemi energetici aerobico e anaerobico, su sistema nervoso, sistema simpatico e parasimpatico, e sulla respirazione. Fondamentalmente sono tre macro aree che si intersecano. Per intenderci, se io respiro naso-naso, ad esempio, e Bozada poi porta tutti i suoi esempi, tutti i suoi metodi per respirare, se naso-naso avrò un'attivazione maggiore del sistema parasimpatico e quindi sarò proiettato verso uno sforzo aerobico. Se invece inizio a respirare bocca a bocca, sposterò la mia fatica sul sistema anaerobico e di conseguenza sul sistema nervoso simpatico. Quindi allenando la respirazione attraverso degli esercizi di cui lui parlava e di cui io ho avuto la fortuna di testare nel suo seminario, possiamo renderci consapevoli della nostra respirazione e quindi adottare delle strategie per ricercare un adattamento. Nella pratica, ad esempio, se io ho una prestazione, sono molto agitato prima di un evento, respirando naso-naso andrò ad attivare il mio sistema parasimpatico e quindi abbasserò l'ansia, abbasserò i miei livelli di stress e sarò pronto per la performance. Come diceva Bozada, tutte queste cose vanno fondamentalmente allenate con degli esercizi. Un esercizio che abbiamo provato al suo seminario è quello l'abbiamo provato sul vogatore, sul row, e consisteva nell'incrementare la velocità provando a respirare con diverse tecniche. Questo può essere una metodologia di allenamento. Per intenderci, se io inizio una prestazione respirando naso-naso, attivo il mio sistema parasimpatico. Supponiamo che stiamo facendo una prestazione di endurance sul vogatore. Via via che la fatica aumenterà, inizierò a respirare naso-bocca, poi respirerò solamente bocca a bocca. Se io queste cose le alleno, posso ritardare l'insorgenza della fatica, dell'accumulo di lattato, posso avere un'ossigenazione migliore a livello dei tessuti e quindi, come diceva lui all'inizio, principi su tutto. Bisogna iniziare dalle basi che, secondo Rob Bozada, sono mobilità e respirazione, che poi ci possono aiutare ad elevare la nostra performance. Ci sono diverse metodologie, abbiamo fatto anche un test sul lavoro ipossico in cui svolgevamo una serie di esercizi e poi, mettendo 2 kettlebell al collo, provavamo a fare andata e ritorno senza respirare. È devastante, però tutte queste cose ad alti livelli in realtà le allenano anche in Italia, non sono da trascurare, quindi la sua filosofia è qualità sopra quantità e quindi, conoscendo il nostro corpo, conoscendo i sistemi energetici, allenando la respirazione, possiamo elevare la nostra performance. Ok, Rob.
Thank you for doing that.
Thank you, Rob. So see you soon. Bye,
okay,
Rob.
Thank you. Thank
Have
you.
a nice day. Have a nice
You
day.
too. Ciao.